if you had it to do over again, over the last 10 years, you wish you had been a buyer in at least 7 of the 10 years with hindsight. Unless you're looking to flip, go in and be prepared for a rough ride if things go wrong. That is, keep your leverage low, etc. Uncertainty is going to knock down construction beyond what import costs are going to do, beyond what interest rates are going to do. Very late 25 and into 26, you're going to have a balancing market because that supply spurt is gone.
Prominent CEOs, leading economists, iconic investors, insights from the experts. The Walker Webcast with Willy Walker. See who's next.
So Peter, before we dive in, what I wanted to do is first of all say hello to everyone here in Chicago. I'm in front of a group of some of the most successful and talented commercial real estate and multifamily developers in the country. And so before I got to you and your perspective on the world, what I wanted to do is get a show of hands in this room. You've got 3 options, and I'm going to ask you to close your eyes so you're not looking around to see what the herd mentality is in the room on the answer to this question. So in a second, I'll give you the 3 things to raise your hand to, and then just close your eyes and we'll do it real quick. And then I'll give a sense of where this room's mood is. So first is that everything that's going on right now from an economic standpoint with the Trump administration is exactly what we need to be doing, and it's going to turn out great. Second, everything that's going on in the Trump administration right now is not where we need to be going, but it's not going to succeed, and we're going to be fine. And third is, hang on, I don't want to see a show of hands yet. I'm going to have you close eyes. The third is, it's all terrible and it's going to end terrible. Okay? So 1 is we're doing exactly what we need to be doing. 2 is we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, but it's going to turn out okay. And 3 is we're not doing what we ought to be doing and it's going to turn out really badly. Okay? Eyes closed. Number 1. Okay. Number 2. And number 3. All right, great. So on number 1 was, this is exactly where we need to be going and what we need to be doing. I'm going to take a guess there were 15 hands that went up. 2, this is not what we should be doing, but it's going to fail and we're going to do fine, was without a doubt the overwhelming response in the room. If there are 200 people in here, there were 120 hands that went up. And number 3, which was, it's poor policy and it's going to end up poorly, was about what number 1 was of its good policy, and it's going to turn out great. So interesting perspectives from this room. Peter, where are you on that?
More or less number 2. We're doing some things that are good. We're doing some things that are stupid, which is kind of always the case. Through my lifetime, at least, we do some things well, and then we find a way to get in our way and do some negatives that knock us down a peg or 2.
But hang on a second. We don't have a time when we get $11 trillion moving out of the equity markets in 2 days. So understanding we clearly have sort of normalized mistakes and positive things going on, $11 trillion moving out of the equity markets and the 10-year going from 398 to 450 in 1 day is not in any way normal.
I didn't say it's normal. Remember, what was it, October 23rd, 1987? The market fell 23% in a day. It wasn't as many dollars, but it was more dollars relative to where we were. Second, I haven't done what I'm about to say today, but at the close yesterday, S&P was where it was at, I think it was August 8th last year. Now, if I would have been talking to people on August 8th last year and said, are you more or less happy with where the market is? They'd have said, yeah, kind of pretty good. Could be better, could be worse. And if I say, will you be in tears if 8 months later it's at the same level? Most people would have said, well, I won't be thrilled, but I won't be in tears if it's at the same level 8 months from now. Well,
But that's only because he pulled back on the policy. That's not because the policy was put in place and the markets recovered because they've digested the policy.
well, but that's part of the game. I mean, people adjust, and that's part of when you ask the question, are we going to be all right? That includes adjustments, right? It's not on autopilot.
Start a legacy. Start turning dreams into realities. A better world begins with you. Better communities start with us.
So then jump into your math on tariffs, because as it relates to that policy, many people are sitting there saying this tariff policy, if enacted to where the president either proposed it or even the modifications that have come subsequently, is going to have a dramatic impact on U.S. GDP growth, inflation, et cetera, et cetera. In this quarter's Linneman letter, you walk through the math behind tariffs and why you think it's actually not as significant as most people think. Will you walk through your math?
Well, let me set it up. When I wrote that, it looked like it was before revolution, right? And it looked like it was going to be about a 3% increase in tariffs from about $2 to $3 per $100 of imports to $5 to $6 of tariffs on $100 of imports. The new math that came out right after we went to press says it's right now closer to $20 of tariffs on $100 we import on average. That's the weighted average. Well, that's obviously a lot bigger. So here's the basic math. First, what's a tariff? You understand that most people had no idea what a tariff was before the last 2, 3, 4 weeks. A tariff is a tax. People say, well, do you think it's going to be good for the economy? If you raise taxes a lot on 10% of the economy, that's not going to be good. I don't care if you're raising income taxes by 17%. I don't care if you're raising corporate taxes by 17%. If you raise taxes on a significant part of the economy, it's not going to be good. And that's all that this is. I say 10% of the economy. We're a $30 trillion economy. Imports are about $3 trillion. That's last year's numbers, but about $3 trillion. If you had, that means that at $20 per 100, it's a little different, Willie, than the math we had.
Right.
At the math of $20 on imports, it says for 1 year, prices on average are going to go up 1.2 percentage points more than they would have otherwise. But once they've risen, it doesn't keep inflating on top of it unless we kept raising the tariff more. So you'd have a one-time shock to inflation of somewhat in excess of 1 percentage point. Okay. And then curiously, as you move to subsequent years, it's actually modestly deflationary. Why? Modest. It won't, and that's because if you're caught in a big thunderstorm, do you just stand there? No, you get out of the thunderstorm. You try to get an umbrella, you get in a car, you get under an awning to minimize the damage. As we minimize the damage, the average tariff will go down from 20, even if no individual tariff is changed, the effective impact will diminish over time. So that 1.2% actually in subsequent years would moderate a little down, okay, as we adjust. Okay, so then the other is GDP. GDP at the number being floated around, which is $20 per 100, is about 1.7% impact negative on GDP. That's big. Think about in a normal year, we grow 2.3 to 2.5% a year. You're wiping out 3/4 of a normal year growth We get some of that back by deregulation, but we're not going to get all that back by deregulation. So it's a big negative impact. And I'll just end the arc, Willie, by saying what I did. Imagine you came on and your lead question was not about tariffs per se. And you said, what do you think will happen if we raise taxes a lot on 10% of the economy? You're not going to be shocked when I say, going to have a negative impact. Now, there is a bright side, I guess. It's raising tax revenue. So if we have $3 trillion in imports and you put a 20% tax on it, you're going to get about 600 billion. That's just math, right? About 600 billion in tax revenue. And our current deficit is about 1.8 trillion. I only give that to give an order of magnitude.
Yeah, but you're going to lose the commensurate income tax off of, your GDP falls by 1.2%. Your economy has come crashing down and you're going to lose it on tax revenue off of everything else. And oh, by the way, as you accurately point out, our economy today is geared towards income tax and corporate tax and not on tariffs. And so as you shift that and say, we're going to bring in $600 billion of additional tariff income, you're going to lose a lot more than that as it relates to overall growth if you've lost 1.2%. And the interesting thing on that, Peter, is your numbers. One of the things I think people need to understand here is the order of magnitude of where things have moved over the last 2 weeks. Peter's numbers in the report were, hey, we're going to take tariffs from 2 to 3% today up to 9%, which is going to return us to a 1967 level tariffs. Right. And if you do that, that's going to cost you somewhere between 20 and 40 basis points on GDP growth. Okay? Which, if you think about it in that context, it's not that big a deal because it's only 15% of the economy that gets hit by those tariffs. So Peter in the letter sits there and says, it's not that big a deal at these levels. I think it's one of the reasons why last week was so impactful was what President Trump launched in the Rose Garden was so outsized in comparison to what anyone had thought he was going to do during the campaign and what Peter had in his numbers all of 3 weeks ago. That's what caught the markets by such surprise.
I totally agree. And by the way, remember the original numbers would have been closer to 25, 27%, right, on 100. So you're exactly right.
So
there
Peter,
is
can I just
one
let me
wild card, and I'm not.
Okay.
The one wild card is if we don't live, we've never lived in a world of free trade, and one of the things we found out is everybody started publishing what everybody else's average tariff was, and they're high, right? It wasn't like we had all these places with zero tariffs. A lot of places have big tariffs, but by the way, just because others poke their eyes out doesn't mean we should poke our eye out, right? We should be smarter. Having said that, Willie, if all this fluster and bluster and whatever you want to call it led to a systematic reduction in global tariffs, including ours, that would be a win. I don't know what probability to put on that. We've just never seen anybody rattle the cage this much. What Trump would say is they're all going to come, they're all going to say they're going to cut their tariffs to basically zero, and then I'll reduce mine. If that world ever transpired, that's a win-win. But right now we're in a lose-lose.
Right. So let's jump into two other things quickly as it relates to inflation, GDP growth. You mentioned the inflationary impact of tariffs. Let's pick your number. I don't care whether it's 6%, 9%, or 20%. As you said, Peter, that's a one-time charge. The cost of this iPhone goes from $1,800 up to $2,500. Right. It's that movement that will be captured. But the question I have for you on that is, Jerome Powell and the Fed know that. And for 2 years post-pandemic, they sat there and said, all the supply chain issues are transitory, inflationary pressures they're going to move through, so we're not going to move rates. So they've said historically, we can look through and see transitory things. Is not a tariff the most blatant transitory hit to the inflation print that would allow for Jerome Powell and the Fed to say, you know what, it's coming one time, but then we reset prices and we're going to look through that and not raise interest rates?
You're 100% right. You got an A. And by the way, that's not a great inflation Ivy League A. That's
I've got one of your, I've got Olivia sitting in the front row here, Peter, and I was just looking at her because I know she got an A in your class at Wharton.
Oh, she did spectacular. That's a real A.
Yeah, right. That's a real A. That's exactly right. Hers is a real A. Mine is a false A. That's exactly right.
But so the inflation part you got right. Remember, the Fed views that they have two missions. One is inflation and one is the economy in general. And so on the inflation side, I think they'll do exactly as you say. However, the minus 1.7% on GDP, that's what they're going to look at. And they're going to say, we're going to cut rates. And as you know, I was saying before all this, 4 rate cuts this year because inflation is in the distant rearview mirror. The most recent data said it. However, the cuts that they will do now are not about inflation. They're about the economy being hit. Okay? And in fact, they're going to do it in addition to give Trump the finger. Now, the interesting thing of it is, as you know, Trump has been saying for some time, the interest rate is too high. When I say give him the finger, what they're doing is saying, if you're going to destroy the economy, we're not going to let it happen. We're going to come to the rescue. We're going to come as the Lone Ranger and save the day, right? The interesting thing is Trump will be happy when they cut the interest rate, because he's been saying that for some time. And a true cynic would say, this is all a way to get the Fed to cut the interest rate.
Well, if you're Scott Bissett, who's so focused on where the 10-year is, which, by the way, everyone in this room and many people listening to the webcast ought to be thrilled that we have a Treasury Secretary who is, I don't want to say myopically, but is very focused on getting the 10-year Treasury rate down to go and refinance $6 trillion of U.S. or issue $6 trillion of U.S. debt this year. I mean, we actually have a Treasury Secretary, no criticism of anyone in the past, just focusing on the current, that actually understands the capital markets and understands the fact that we have a huge amount of country debt that needs to be refied, and that he wants to do that in a way that is most economically advantageous to us. Some past Treasury secretaries sat there and just sort of said, hey, rates are at 2%, but I'm going to go short and issue 2-year paper at 2%. I mean, the fact that our Treasury did not sit there and say, let's go long when we've got rates this low is what has set us up for the predicament we're in today. But to have
we talked about back when. We had that discussion back when.
Big time. We had that conversation back when. And they didn't do anything on it.
Among the things that help keep the 10-year down right now, don't get the Chinese to where they want to dump.
Yeah, but talk about that for a second, Peter, because see, so first of all, do you think last week's move in the 10-year was due to the Chinese and the Japanese dumping? And the other thing that I'd ask you before you respond to that is this. You know these numbers very, very well. The Chinese only hold $800 billion of U.S. treasuries. The Japanese only hold $1 trillion of U.S. treasuries. And while those sound like big numbers, in comparison to $36 trillion outstanding, it's a rounding error. That's 40 basis points that the Chinese hold. So they can clearly manipulate the market for a week, but they can't manipulate it forever.
Correct. You're correct, although your debt number's wrong because you didn't net out debt that the government owes itself. Okay.
36 trillion is total outstanding. We can go through backing out the 6
go down to about 20 trillion.
You're going to get back to it. But you're not going to argue with me on the fact that there's $8 trillion of U.S. paper that is owned by foreign countries. And of that 8 trillion, the Japanese have $1 trillion and the Chinese
That's
have
correct.
$800 billion.
That's okay. And I think they're going to say, I don't want half of that dumped, right? Because I think you're right, in the big scheme, it wouldn't matter, but sure would matter in the window in which they dumped.
Yeah,
right?
no doubt. No doubt whatsoever. But do you think that that's what made the market do what it did last week?
No, I think what made the market I'm not a market maven, but if I had to say what it is, which is no one can figure out what the hell's going on, and the risk premium goes way up. And I've said, I think I said the last time, the whole yield curve, but let's just focus on the 10-year Treasury for the moment. You do understand, audience, that the 10-year Treasury quote is effectively trying to figure out the Super Bowl winner 10 years from now and betting on it. Namely, the circumstances that are ultimately going to create what should have been the 10-year Treasury with perfect hindsight, right? We're betting on today. And just as, imagine you were betting on the Super Bowl winner. The yield curve is who's going to win the Super Bowl next season, the season after that, the season after that, the season after that. Well, just as in the Super Bowl context, some of those kids, when you get out there 9, 10 years, they're not even out of high school yet. They're going to be the players on the 10-year. The events that are going to cause what the 10 years should have been, many of them aren't going to happen for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. So I can't do better. Don't misunderstand. I'm not saying I can do better, but noise really affects it. And there's no doubt there's a lot of noise. And in fact, I think the biggest thing right now is, if you've ever had a time to focus on fundamentals, it's now. Turn down the noise. Every day, everybody should wake up. And I also have this phrase, leave the fright house. A fright house is fun for 2 hours before Halloween, but you can't stay in there all the time. It jangles you, it disorients you. Imagine if you were in one of those fright houses endlessly, and if all you watched were horror movies, you'd be a wreck. Leave the fright house. Tune down the noise. What's tune down the noise? Okay, give you a tune down the noise. Tune down the noise is that, say what you will, GDP was pretty strong in the first quarter. Say what you will, employment was pretty strong in the first quarter. We're only a few weeks past the first quarter, right? It's not like we're forever past. Say what you will, unemployment insurance claims last week were very solid. And I could go on. Inflation is down. That's focus on the fundamentals, tune out the noise. If Turkey can grow,
you can't.
We'll
you
grow.
Just told us a moment ago. Hang on a second, because you just told us a moment ago we could have a 1.2% hit to GDP. So your 2.7 number, which you gave me 3 months ago in January, 2.7%.
Yep.
Okay.
Could easily be down to 1% for 1 year. Could easily be
1% for 1 year. Are you revising your 2.7 for this year?
Not yet.
Oh.
No, not yet. Simply for the reason we're in early innings on this thing. And any adjustment that I would make is not being made on fundamentals. It's being made on noise. And I just don't want to adjust it on noise. I can do the mathematics.
Okay.
But I don't want to adjust it until I see a lot more distance on where this is going.
So you said S&P was going to be up 7 to 9% in 2025. It's off 8% year to date. Where are you for the end of the year?
Same type of answer. I think it will actually be up a bit, but not as high as I thought. And the reason is very simple. Most of what I think it's down on is confusion. By the way, I'm confused. You're confused. You follow this stuff very closely. I follow it closely. Confusion raises the risk premium. I think as time goes by, the confusion will go down. That may or may not mean we like the policies, but the confusion factor will go down.
Okay, so let's turn to oil for a second, Peter, because you and I spoke last week, and we were talking about the inflation impact of tariffs. And I said to you, how much does $60 a barrel oil impact the CPI? And your response was, with no hesitation, by the way, to those in the room, in the south of France on a yacht. That was Peter, not me.
Italy, but be that as it may.
Italy, but same deal. Was 100 basis points.
Yeah.
100 basis points.
Yeah, because so there, that's why I say I'm willing to change my forecasts, as you know. There's just too many moving parts still that are moving by the moment. And it's almost like, why do you waste your time running through the calculations and pretend you've got better insight than you've got? Is that a fair way of saying it? I mean,
it is. I mean, it sort of feels to me like why you go and do what your actual unemployment number is versus the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You do it on a quarterly basis. Every quarter, you're somewhere between 200. You basically say the BLS is 200 to 250 basis points underreporting unemployment on where your numbers actually are. And my question to you is then why do you keep tracking it if it is a nonsensical data point?
Well, it's not nonsensical. It's just the nice thing about their data is it is the same data, right?
Right. It's consistent, right?
It's consistently wrong, if you will, but it's consistently collected, right? And, that's useful. That's useful.
Well, it's useful in the extent that, so to talk about this for 1 second, because I think one of the things on the tariffs thing that does have everyone sort of, and this plays into commercial real estate and the cost of inputs and labor. I think one of the things that has been most unsettling to people in the commercial real estate space has been, okay, we don't have clarity on tariffs, but one of the reasons for it might be to reshore manufacturing. And if they are successful in reshoring manufacturing, that means that the labor pool is only going to get tighter, that someone could go work in a factory or come work on my construction site. And if we're already at 4.2% unemployment, if you're really successful at reshoring all this manufacturing, and also you're successful at deporting illegals, it's going to create a much, much tighter labor base. And therefore, my cost of manufacturing that single family home or that multifamily property or the office building is going to go up precipitously because of the cost of labor in the United States going up a lot. Tell me where I just went wrong on why people are scratching their heads.
Well, I just don't see how you get a lot of reshoring happening in any reasonable period of time. What?
Okay, so we take that off the table.
Yeah, you're suddenly going to have what? You think by June we're going to have a lot of U.S. factories that didn't. You think by June next year? You think
but people in this room, they're looking at plans. If you look right now, we have a quarterly deck at Walker & Dunlop that's our market intelligence group puts out, and we just published it last week. And it talks about a couple things. One, consumer sentiment and the University of Michigan consumer confidence numbers, which, as you know, Peter, have fallen off the table so dramatically. Even before last week, they'd fallen down. Normal run rate there is about 75. It's down at 56, 57 right now. So it's way, way down. So consumer confidence has come down dramatically. But the other issue to it is if you look at the sentiment of owners of multifamily, of either buy, sell, or build. The top of the graph has got build, and it got pretty big a couple years ago, and build is now this little tail at the top of it. And what you have is a sentiment in the market that has shifted dramatically from in 2022, everyone wanted to sell, and there were actually a few buyers. Now there's a stack of buyers waiting to buy, but nobody wants to sell at where cap rates are right now. And so consumer sentiment has changed a lot. And so I think what people in this room are trying to figure out is, am I going forward with planning to put a shovel in the ground and build into that market, and thinking about where labor is going to be not 6 months from now, because no factory is going to be built in the next 6 months, but a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now.
So I'll give an agnostic answer that answers to that audience. I would bet that if you had it to do over again, over the last 10 years, you wish you had been a buyer in at least 7 of the 10 years with hindsight. And by the way, if we went over 20 years, I'll bet you wish you had been a buyer in about 14 to 15 of the years. And over a 30-year window, I'll bet you wish you had been a buyer in about 23 of the years. Now, what's that say? Unless you're looking to flip, go in and be prepared for a rough ride if things go wrong. That is, keep your leverage low, et cetera. Second is uncertainty is going to knock down construction beyond what import costs are going to do, beyond what interest rates are going to do. Just uncertainty is going to have a near-term impact. So, Willie, we talked, I think, the last 3 times about how very late 25 and into 26, you're going to have a balancing market because that supply spurt is gone. It's going to be gone longer than we thought, say, 3 months ago, because of this uncertainty currently.
Yeah, let's dive into that for 2 seconds, because you just said a balancing market. It's not a balancing market, is it? It's going to become an unbalanced market. You use the term in this quarterly Linneman letter that you are reiterating rent spikes in multifamily, rent spikes, not rent increases, rent spikes in 26 and 27. You want to talk about a balancing market. 2024 was a balancing market. We had historic deliveries in 2024 in multifamily, and all of it was absorbed. All of it. So 23 and 22, we were upside down on absorption versus deliveries, and we had negative absorption. In 2024, we actually had positive absorption in a year that had more supply come online than we've ever seen before. So when you talk about we're going to have a balancing, it's going to be wildly imbalanced in 26 and 27.
Well, you're right. I mean, stating a different way, what I meant was you're going to see positive rent increases again, and you're going to see them to a fairly large extent in almost all markets, because supplies come down, but demand has stayed pretty well. And I don't see demand going away in the near term. I don't see a recession happening. I do see the economy could slow, though, if we keep taxes that high on 10% of the economy, right? And so it is a little unclear, but I feel good about multi. People are going to live somewhere. We still have this massive shortage of single-family housing. That's not going to go away. None of this is going to help the single-family housing shortage go away. So if I'm in the multi-space, I feel pretty good. Maybe I only feel pretty good because I could be in other spaces. I don't know, but not bad. It's just not bad.
So let's talk about that for 2 seconds. You just talked about single-family housing, which is obviously, if you will, the competitive alternative to multi. Okay, and you talk in the letter about 1 million single-family homes being developed on an annual basis. That doesn't close the 3 million shortfall that you have been stating exists since the GFC to today. In that deck that I talked about that we just put out, there's a really interesting graph that I'll just talk through quickly to then prompt to the question to you, Peter, which is just that the median U.S. single-family home in 2020 cost $285,000.
Yeah.
Today, that home is $385,000. So it's added $100,000 on the median priced single-family home in America over that period of time. Then if you go in and look at what the average cost of renting in America back in 2020 was, and what the average P&I payments on that single-family $285,000 home was, if you own the home, you were somewhere between $200 and $300 in the black as it relates to your P&I payments were $200 to $300 less than if you were the average renter in America. It's like $1,500 to $1,800 is the delta between those two. Now move up to the $385,000 single family home today, and you're completely upside down on your P&I payments versus your average rent. Your average rent is today somewhere between $400 and $500 less than P&I payments on that $385,000 home. So housing, single family housing, has become thoroughly unaffordable for middle America. And so
yes, but
there's
a different twist. There's a slightly different twist. First of all, again, you're not going to stand in the rain. What people are going to do in the face of that, or a lot of people, don't buy the corner house, buy the house 2 lots in. Don't buy the one with the fancy new kitchen. Buy the one with a kitchen that needs to be.
Yeah,
That
but
deals
hang on
with
a second.
some of it.
Let me push back on that for a second, because here's the deal with that. As you well know, everyone who owns that house that's not the corner one but in the middle of the block has a 3.2% 30-year fixed rate mortgage.
Correct.
That is not going to have them sell that house, which means the only way you move to that cheaper one is that you get new supply that hits that lower price point, and the single family home builders are not building that lower price point.
You are getting some of those homes sold because people die, people get jobs in a different city, they retire, but it's slow. There's no doubt. The other way that people deal with it is they'll stay in multifamily longer, whether they like it or not. They'll build up a bigger equity cushion, because if instead of putting 10% down, they put 20% down, they bring down that number you were talking about, right? It's not quite apples to apples, but it brings it down to be affordable. That's good for multifamily because they stayed, not only because to get a 10% down payment took longer, but to get a 20% down payment or a 25% down payment instead of a 10 also kicked in. And that's not going to go away. And I think my memory is Ivy's got a number not so different than mine in terms of the shortfall. I think Goldman has a number not so different. I think Ken Rosen has a number not so. So it's not even, quote, just Peter's number in this case. It's kind of anybody who's awake number. Single family is fundamentally underproduced. And that's why home prices keep rising.
And you say we're not going to close that shortfall for a decade. In this quarterly letter, you say it's going to take us a decade to close that shortfall. Does that mean that you ought to just go out and buy any home builder today and just hang on to the stock for the next decade?
Well, more or less, yeah.
Yeah, okay. That's
less.
That's what I wanted to hear.
I mean, it has to, the question is how much of it is priced in. Some of it is already priced in. But I don't know how it gets eliminated even in a decade. I really don't. That would mean for 10 years, including a year or two that had a cycle on the downturn, right? And a year or two that had crazy stuff happen.
You're doing $1.2 million a year.
300,000 more a year than normal. I don't see that happening, right? With NIMBYs and so forth. By the way, I came to a conclusion the other day. I was talking to somebody who was saying, these are unprecedented times. It's a once in a lifetime kind of time. And I said, I'm 74, and every year I've been alive is unprecedented. It's just unprecedented in a different way. And
you talked about that. One thing that I thought was an interesting stat was where was real per capita net wealth when you were born versus today? I think it's at $89,000 today, and when you were born, you said it, and I've got it. I don't have my note here, but it was like $22,000.
It's staggering. I think it's fair to say people should look at it because it's staggering, the increase. Yeah,
it's incredible the wealth accumulation that's happening.
The wealth accumulation, the income accumulation, the longevity accumulation is stunning.
But that's a good segue to the consumer. So you have in the quarterly letter, which you got a ton of data on the U.S. consumer and what they own and their assets and where we are. The one data point that I always go to on a quarterly basis is your debt to disposable income ratio, which basically says, take a look at what they have as far as cash flow coming in and what all their liabilities are and where they are. And I thought it struck me this quarter, Peter, that the debt to cash flow ratio that you calculate has dropped from the high 80% to the high 70%, 10 points of improvement from 2019 to 2025.
And by the way, you described why earlier, and that's because 42% or so of the population locked in a super cheap mortgage and allows their total debt service to be a lot lower than it would otherwise be. But when I say otherwise, by historic norms, right, would be.
Right. And so, you and I have talked about this extensively. A lot of people have been concerned about credit card debt, and you have said consistently The fact that there's $1 trillion of credit card debt outstanding is more of people using it as an ATM card and not the fact that they're using the credit behind it. They're just using it because it's an ease of payment rather than convenience, rather than that's
transactional convenience.
Exactly. But if you look at the bank earnings and credit card charge-offs, and you mentioned it in the letter, they have ticked up. Not a lot. It's basis points, not percentage points, but we're back at kind of a normalized credit card delinquency rate in a normalized economy. Obviously, they got much, much better in the pandemic because everyone was getting checks from the US government, and therefore we had no credit card delinquencies. They've come back to a normal run rate. So if credit card debt is okay, if mortgages are locked in, and if the overall debt to consumer income ratio is down at almost a historic low, you're saying the consumer is strong and will be able to get through whatever downturn in GDP we get over the next year?
Yeah. And remember, the one thing you left out, they still have huge cash balances.
Right. So jump in on that because the numbers on cash balances are staggering.
Staggering. We pumped a lot. The reason we didn't get truly runaway inflation, either after the financial crisis or after COVID, and we know in both instances, huge amounts of money was pumped into the system, right? But we didn't get Milton Friedman kind of runaway inflation like you'd expect. And that's because people, including businesses, held on to way, way more of the cash. So the so-called velocity of money, the speed at which we turned it over, went down almost commensurate with the rate at which the money came in. That means they're sitting on good cash balances. Now, by the way, just to be fair, you hear this number, whatever it is, 22% of Americans can't come up with $400, right? I'm not saying every individual is in the catbird seat, but I can tell you in the aggregate, it looks pretty good. They have jobs still. We have growth. Yes, it could get knocked down, considerable growth, but it still would be growth. They still have inflation is moderated and not stunning. I don't want to knock 1.7 percentage points off of GDP growth. That can't be good, right? That's why I'm generally for lower taxes, including tariffs, right? I mean, I want lower taxes. So it is funny, by the way. I have to say one thing. As you know, I'm not political. I'm kind of a Milton Friedman libertarian who always thinks whatever's in is doing stupid stuff. But you have to admit, it is funny, ironic funny, that that the Democrats were talking about we're going to have to raise taxes. We're going to have to raise taxes. When we get elected, we're going to raise taxes and we're going to raise taxes. And Trump's saying, nope, we're not going to raise taxes. We're not going to raise taxes. And Trump has raised taxes on 10% of the economy by a lot. And the Democrats are the ones saying, no, don't raise taxes, don't raise taxes. There is a bizarreness of all that.
Well, there's a bizarreness of it, and there's also a understanding of the political system where he can do these trade deals on his own without going to Congress, whereas if he's going to do a tax deal, he's got to go to Congress. I thought the other thing that you do say in the letter, Peter, is you don't think that this administration expends a whole lot of time and energy on the tax bill, that you think that they're going to just basically ask for an extension of the existing tax rates, which is interesting because you do see the Trump administration moving to, this isn't tax cuts. It's an extenuation of what's actually exists today, which is a little bit of their messaging to sort of say, we're not coming in to bring taxes down further. We just want to extend the Trump tax credits, tax cuts from 2017. There was one
and
other
they'll do the couple they promised or not promised, promoted during the campaign, which was no tax on Social Security income, no income tax.
On tips, which
on
you
tips.
rightfully point out is a rounding error.
It's a rounding error in revenue. It's a rounding error. It makes me feel like I got something, but I didn't really get much, right? And so they'll do that kind of stuff.
Which I would just make one quick point on that, which I thought about it when you talked about the small impact of tips. And I was thinking about the campaigning on it and how big an issue that was in the campaign where it actually turns into nothing. And one of the things I think is so interesting about this is that in an interesting way, when Trump goes and talks about reshoring manufacturing, what he was able to do in places like West Virginia and Ohio is give those voters hope that there was going to be a job for them in the future. And it's really interesting to think about the politics of this. Barack Obama won 2 terms on hope. That's what he was successful at branding hope, that things were going to get better, that your job was going to get better. What you clearly have seen is this big swath of the American public that whether they worked in manufacturing or lower level service jobs had lost hope that they could ever get a job again because they hadn't been retrained, they hadn't been retooled. And all of a sudden along comes Donald Trump saying, I'm going to get all these plants out of other places in the world. Don't worry whether you like the job or don't like the job. I'm going to give you hope that you at some point are going to be employable again. And I think that that's the wave from a political standpoint. Whether it's an economic reality or not, doesn't really matter. The reason so many people backed him is because he was actually giving them hope that they might be able to get a job, which I think is not a minor thing to keep in mind as you think about why he's in the seat today and who actually supports his efforts.
Now, I would agree on that. I'm not a political maven, but clearly people were reacting against what is loosely called woke. And I think that part of his program, I think, has pretty broad support, not 100% support. If you go back to your 1, 2, 3 kind of model, and you said on the woke dimension, I think you would find a lot of ones that were on the right track. And that was also a big part of the election.
Right. So I want to close off on cash for a quick moment because there's some stats in there that I think are important for everyone in the room and watching the webcast to keep in mind. And then I want to go to a couple other asset classes, and then we got to close it down, and we're going to go to Q&A here in the room. On the cash one, though, Peter has this data, and I'm not reading notes, so I'm just going to use it off the top of my head. I had specific notes on it, but there's about $165 trillion of assets that Americans own. 165 trillion. If you look inside of that, about 70 trillion, and these are rounded numbers, but about 70 trillion of it is non-equity financial assets, which is treasuries, corporate debt, muni bonds, all that kind of stuff, about 70 trillion. 37 trillion is equities. 35 trillion is home equity. Correct. Thought that was interesting that equities in the stock market and home equity sit about the same. And then cash is like 22 trillion, cash and money market. So to Peter's point as it relates to the US consumer having cash, now Elon Musk may have 18 of that $22 trillion sitting in his bank account. But my point is that there is a massive cash cushion. And if you think about the assets that we have, how much is in debt capital markets at 70 trillion, equity capital markets is roughly 35 trillion, same as home equity, and then cash at like $20 trillion. I thought as I read through Peter's numbers on that, it was really helpful to understand that when he talks about that, how big a cash pile the U.S. consumer sits on.
So let me pick up one thing, and I'll just take the simplest version of it. As you say, equities are about the same as people's equity in their home. Ballpark, right? Remember I said that since August, I think I said 8th, the stock market has been flat, okay? What's happened to people's home prices in that intervening time?
Right.
Therefore, people are wealthier than they were 8 months ago, even though the market has just fallen by whatever percent from its peak. Real people, are wealthier today than they were August 8th, the last time the market was at this level. And so when I say try to filter the noise, that's what I mean. So filtering the noise is every time you see the stock market fall, first thing I do is go back and say, when was the last time it was at this level? And was I panicked when it was at that level, or did I feel good? All right. That's turning down the filter on the noise, right? When people are panicking, I look at the unemployment insurance claims and say, where are they at versus norms? Now,
just as an aside on that, they were at 6.2 million this week 5 years ago. 6.2 million uninsurance claims 5 years ago this week. 220,000 today.
222,000 or so this week.
Right.
So I don't want to create the impression everything is wonderful. You mentioned the one interesting thing, well, the really interesting thing, which is even though the data is showing pretty good sentiment, and I include the stock market, I include the bond market as sentiment indicators, right? Nobody knows what NPV to really calculate. They're sentiment indicators. You mentioned consumer sentiment. You mentioned small business optimism sentiment. So what we've got is a situation where in the last month or two, the data on reality is not so bad, but the data on sentiment is quite dour. And the question in an odd way is,
isn't that the time to go? Isn't that the time to be contrarian and put your money to work?
Does sentiment adjust to reality, or does reality adjust to sentiment? Historically, sentiment adjusts to reality. And so, for example, since COVID, there have been 4 times people have said we are now going to have a recession. And I kept saying, no, no, no. All right. And the reason was simply I was looking at reality, and reality wasn't suggesting it, but sentiment was. And I'm not saying that is always the case, but generally, sentiment adjusts to reality. You know, think of the Kansas City Chiefs fans watching the Eagles pummel them. And you know that a diehard fan was sitting there.
I knew you were going to do that. You know, you raised football before, and I didn't jump in purposefully to give you the opportunity to gloat in your Eagles' victory.
No,
but I will say on the forward markets, hang on, I got to take this out. On the forward markets, they say that the Washington Commanders are going to win the Super Bowl 3 times in 5, 6, and 7 years out. So as a Commanders fan, I was really happy on those forward markets. But anyway, go ahead.
He's a very talented guy. But, you know, on the sentiment versus reality, I watched the game with a former NFL player, and he basically said, game's over with 2 minutes to go in the first half because of, the sentiment of every Kansas City Chief fan and a lot of Eagles fans were Mahomes is going to come back. And eventually reality became sentiment, right? Eventually. That generally is true in life. Reality eventually becomes sentiment. Right now, people are kind of believing sentiment becomes reality. And I don't think that's going to happen.
All right. I got to close this out before we go to Q&A in here. Just real quick, across other asset classes, we've focused a lot on housing and multifamily, and that's the group that's here and what they're really focused on. But I was surprised by 17 of your 44 office markets are now back in line. That is a major change in your data as it relates to office.
They're improving. They're improving really slowly in the rent and occupancy sense, and they're improving really slowly in the capital market sense. You had John on. John Gray was on, 2 weeks ago?
Yeah, he came on.
Think about it. John, and I'm not trying to quote him, but John said, yep, we're tiptoeing into office. I'm involved in a equity commonwealth. We sold a building to Lone Star. Those guys weren't there buying offices a year ago. And when I say those guys with institutional money, they're starting to tiptoe back in, but it's slow. And there's still a lot of uncertainty there.
And then on retail, your number is, what was it? The number $620 billion of retail sales in the month of March.
Yeah,
roughly. I think that's right. 620 billion. That's a very healthy retail sales number. And you still like retail?
I like retail. I like good retail. Never have liked bad retail. I like retail. What's
anything? Good? Nobody likes bad anything.
Alex Haubman was one of the first lessons he told me. I learned from him back in the 86 when I was learning stuff from him was you cannot buy retail cheaply enough to fill it if people don't want to shop there, because you cannot, by lowering your rent, change the price of Cheerios, right? That's different than an apartment, that's different than a warehouse, that's different than an office building, right? Where you directly affect the decision maker. But with retail, you don't directly affect the decision maker. So I like retail wherever people want to shop because I think the economy will grow. Stay tuned for how big the tariff impact will be, which would slow it.
I'm going to close us out on the webcast and go to Q&A here with the YPO group in Chicago. To all of you who joined us, and I see the thousands that are on the number down below, thank you for being patient as we streamed in at the beginning of this, and thank you for sticking around a little bit beyond the bottom of the hour, which we're usually pretty good at starting and stopping right on the bottom of the hour. And we'll see you again next week. My guest next week, Captain Chris Cassidy. I already did this interview, and it was one of the most engaging interviews I've ever done. Captain Chris Cassidy is a graduate of the Naval Academy, Navy SEAL, commander of SEAL Team 3, turned U.S. astronaut, turned chief astronaut of the United States of America, who's done 3 space flights. He's one of 3 people who have been a Navy SEAL turned into astronaut. And the things that Chris and I talked about as it relates to leadership and the experiences he's had in his life in both defending the United States of America and then also exploring space for the United States of America is really a phenomenal conversation. So anyone who wants to join in for us next week, come listen to Chris and me. Peter, I'm going to take this down. You're going to stay on, but we're going to go off the webcast. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this week. And Peter, thank you for all you put in.
Thank you.